Normally when we think about society, we just picture this giant container. And inside that container, well, it's us, human beings, right?
Right. It's the most intuitive assumption we make.
Yeah, like we are the building blocks. We're the citizens, the members. If you were to, zoom in on society, you'd just see a bunch of people. It feels as obvious as saying a brick wall is made of bricks.
Exactly. We assume human agency is the center of gravity for anything we call the social.
But then you step into the world of Niklas Luhmann, and he flips the entire container upside down.
He really does.
He looks you dead in the eye and says, well, if you think you are a member of society, you are wrong.
Yeah. It's a shock to read for the first time.
According to his theory, like your physical body, your neurological brain, your individual consciousness, you are not actually a part of society at all. You are just in its environment. You're on the outside looking in. Or I guess rather, the system is on the inside looking out at you.
It is the absolute definition of a theoretical earthquake. It's highly counterintuitive, but once you map out the mechanics of why he constructs this post-humanist architecture, it completely rewrites how you view institutions, politics, and your own autonomy.
And we are pulling all of this apart today on this deep dive using a really phenomenal stack of sources. Primarily, we're looking at the translated transcripts of Luhmann's 1991 to 92 lectures at the University of Bielefeld.
Right, published as Introduction to Systems Theory.
Exactly. Translated by Peter Gilgan, edited by Dirk Becker. We also have critical insights from Dietrich Schwanitz and that incredibly dense but helpful Unlocking Luhmann glossary by Beraldi, Corsi, and Esposito.
The glossary is a lifesaver, honestly.
Yeah, absolutely. But what makes these transcripts so vital is that they are oral, right? We aren't just reading some polished, impenetrable treatise. We are actually in the lecture hall. We're watching Luhmann's thought process unfold in real time.
Yeah, he brings you right into the workshop of his theory construction. You get to watch him dismantle classical sociology piece by piece.
And he kind of had to dismantle it, didn't he? Because he began with a rather brutal diagnosis.
He did. He said sociology in the late 20th century was basically suffering from a terminal illness. He called it a theoretical crisis.
A theoretical crisis.
Right. Luhmann looked at his own field and saw a discipline that was entirely trapped by the ghosts of its 19th century founders.
Which, looking at the landscape he was critiquing, it makes total sense. If you are relying on Karl Marx's base and superstructure, or, Max Weber's theories of rationalization, or Emil Durkheim's ideas of social solidarity, you're using tools designed for the Industrial Revolution.
Exactly. You're bringing a hammer to fix a computer network.
Right. Those thinkers provided brilliant insights for their time, obviously. But trying to use a 19th century map to navigate a hyper-financialized, globally entangled, ecologically fragile, late 20th century highway system, it's just doomed to fail.
Yeah, Marx didn't have to theorize high-frequency algorithmic trading.
No, he didn't. And Weber didn't have to account for a global climate crisis that just, crosses every conceivable national and institutional boundary.
That is the core of Luhmann's frustration right there.
Yeah.
Sociology was attempting to solve this hypercomplexity by piling up mountains of empirical data.
Just endless surveys.
Endless surveys.
Yeah.
Researchers were running statistics on specific communities, tracking localized behaviors, but they were doing this without a unifying macro theory capable of handling modern realities. Luhmann argued the discipline was just gathering complexity with no direction because it lacked a foundational, rigorous definition of what the social actually is as an independent reality.
This is all just, applied psychology or applied economics?
Pretty much, yeah.
So he decides to reboot the entire operating system of sociology. And his point of departure for this reboot is an American sociologist named Talcott Parsons.
Right. Luhmann actually studied under Parsons at Harvard in 1960.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. And Parsons was a giant at the time. He was attempting to build a grand unifying theory of society. And the core proposition that Parsons put forward, which becomes the launchpad for Luhmann, is basically a 3-word sentence. Action is system.
Action is system. Okay, let's unpack that.
Well, Parsons recognized that social reality couldn't just be reduced to biology or psychology. Society is a reality sui generis. It's a thing of its own. Parsons argued that an action doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
For any action to occur, it requires a systemic framework to make it possible. You need human actors, certainly, but you also need culturally shared symbols, values and environments. So Parsons built this massive framework called structural functionalism to map out how these systems survive, how they maintain their boundaries, and how they fulfill their necessary functions.
Let's break down how Parsons actually structured this, because he created this highly rigid categorization method called the AGIL schema.
It's the famous AGIL schema, yeah.
Yeah. He used these cross-classification tables to argue that any action system has to fulfill 4 basic functions to avoid completely collapsing. So I'm looking at the A and the G right now, adaptation and goal attainment. Adaptation is about the system adapting to its external environment and gathering resources, which Parsons maps onto the economy.
Yes.
And then goal attainment is the system defining and achieving its primary goals, right? Mobilizing those resources. And that maps onto politics. Am I reading his architecture correctly here?
You are, perfectly.
Yep.
And then he moves inward to maintain the system's actual coherence. So the I stands for integration.
Integration.
Yeah. A system has to keep its internal parts functioning smoothly together, resolving conflicts, building solidarity. This is the social system itself. Legal system, community norms, basically the rules that bind people together.
Got it. And the L.
For only the L is latent pattern maintenance.
I always found that phrase, latent pattern maintenance, to be such a clunky piece of jargon.
Oh, it is extremely clunky.
But if I apply it to a real-world scenario, kind of makes sense. Like, think about the U.S. Constitution. It functions as latent pattern maintenance for American political values.
That's a great example.
Because even when Congress is out of session, or, when you were just at home sleeping, those foundational cultural and legal values still exist in a dormant state. They are maintained in latency through culture, education, family, just waiting to be activated.
Exactly.
So you have adaptation as economy, goal attainment as politics, integration as law and social norms, and latent pattern maintenance as culture.
It is an incredibly comprehensive architecture. He literally attempts to categorize every human action into one of those functional boxes.
But the immediate reaction I have when looking at Parsons' AGIL schema is that it feels like a massive, obsessive filing cabinet.
A filing cabinet, yes.
It's like he walked into the universe with a label maker and said, okay, going to the grocery store goes in the economy folder, voting goes in the politics folder, going to school goes in the culture folder. It's a hyper-complex labeling system, but it doesn't seem to explain the actual engine of how the system operates or how it adapts to chaos. If society is a filing cabinet for Parsons, it feels entirely static.
And that is the precise critique Luhmann levels at his former teacher. It's a magnificent cathedral of thought, but it has absolutely no moving parts.
Wow.
Parsons subordinated the actor to the action, meaning the human actor is treated almost as an accidental vehicle for the system's functional needs. And furthermore, structural functionalism became pathologically obsessed with system maintenance and equilibrium.
Equilibrium, meaning staying balanced.
Right. The entire theoretical apparatus was built to explain how a system stays stable and harmonious. And Luhmann viewed this obsession with equilibrium as a fatal flaw.
Because if your theory is built entirely around how things stay the same, it shatters the moment you have to explain how things change or, how things die.
Precisely.
Like, if we look at biology, studying an organism is straightforward in one regard. You know exactly when the system has failed because the organism dies. The boundary of death is physical, it's absolute. But sociology lacks that clear physical criterion.
Right. A society doesn't have a heartbeat that flatlines.
Exactly. If we take a historical example, like the Society of France before the French Revolution, the revolution happens, the monarchy is beheaded, the entire legal structure is rewritten from scratch. Did that social system, quote unquote, die? Or did it just change its clothes and its identity?
Structural functionalism just couldn't give a rigorous mechanistic answer to that question. How much does a structure have to mutate before it is categorized as a totally new system? Parsons' model was too hermetic. It was completely sealed off from the explosive new developments happening in biology and cybernetics during the mid-20th century.
He missed the scientific revolution happening right next door.
He did. Parsons had the correct intuition. That action requires a system. But his blueprint for what a system actually is was outdated. To build a theory capable of handling modern complexity, Luhmann had to integrate the evolution of general systems theory.
Which means moving from rigid mechanical equilibrium to open dynamic networks.
And the lectures trace this shift beautifully. In the early and mid-20th century, early systems models across economics and engineering were obsessed with balance, right?
Yes.
The balance of trade, the balance of power. The foundational assumption was that stability inherently equals balance. But then thinkers like the Hungarian economist János Kornai start challenging this.
Kornai is crucial here.
Yeah, he introduces anti-equilibrium theory. He proposes that disequilibrium, like Partial structural imbalance can actually be the very condition that creates stability.
Now, Kornai's work is vital here because it is a purely systemic observation. It's totally divorced from any normative or political judgment. Right, and we should clarify for the listener, we aren't taking any political sides here. We're just impartially mapping out the economic models Kornai used for his systems analysis.
Absolutely. He just demonstrated that economic systems frequently stabilize through an intentional self-perpetuating imbalance. For instance, capitalist systems often achieve stability by maintaining a scarcity of buyers relative to an abundance of goods.
Meaning there is perpetually more supply searching for demand.
Exactly, and that imbalance is what drives the systemic engine forward. Socialist systems, conversely, stabilize their structures through a scarcity of goods relative to an abundance of buyers, so demand constantly outstripping supply.
I want to make sure we isolate the mechanics of that rather than getting bogged down in the politics of those models. The systemic takeaway is that balance is not a prerequisite for survival. A system can ride the chaotic wave of imbalance to stay alive. It's almost like riding a bicycle. You are constantly falling slightly to one side or the other, and you're using forward momentum and micro-corrections to avoid crashing. Equilibrium on a bicycle means you are standing still, which, usually means you fall over.
That forward momentum requires energy, which leads us directly to the rise of open systems theory. In physics, the second law of thermodynamics dictates that closed systems inevitably tend toward entropy.
Maximum disorder, heat death, chaos.
Right. If biological or social systems were truly closed, they would simply decay into static noise. So, to survive, they must be open. They have to exchange energy or information with their environment to produce negentropy. Negative entropy, the generation of internal order.
Okay, got it. And early sociology tried to adapt this thermodynamic principle by treating society like a machine processing raw materials from the environment. They used what's called the input-output model. David Easton famously applied this to political science, right?
Yes, the black box model.
Right, the black box model. The idea was that a political system takes inputs from the environment, citizen demands, protests, taxes, it processes them internally, and then spits out outputs in the form of legislation or public services.
And the black box model acknowledges that the system is performing a selective operation. It is taking raw environmental chaos and turning it into structured output. But the model treats the internal mechanism as completely unknowable or just irrelevant. You see what goes in, you see what comes out, but the actual transformation process is a black box.
It is essentially like knowing a recipe requires flour, sugar, and eggs as inputs, and knowing it yields a cake as an output, but having absolutely no conceptual understanding of what an oven is,
right,
or how heat causes chemical reactions. You just slide the ingredients into a dark void and wait for the cake.
And Luhmann realizes this just isn't enough. We have to open the oven. We need to know how the system manages the overwhelming, infinite chaos of the environment. And this is where he pulls from the cyberneticist W. Ross Ashby and his concept of requisite variety.
Requisite variety. Okay, what does Ashby argue?
Ashby's law of requisite variety basically states that a system cannot possibly match its environment point by point. The environment is infinitely complex. Think about it. If your biological brain attempted to consciously process every single sensory input bombarding it right now.
Oh, man. Like the feeling of my clothes, every fluctuation in room temperature.
Every microscopic sound, the dust particles in the air.
Yeah, my neurological system would overload and collapse instantly.
Exactly. Therefore, a system must drastically reduce complexity. It survives by actively ignoring almost everything. Ashby also introduced the idea of step functions and ultrastability, explaining how systems localize disturbances so a shock to one part doesn't destroy the whole thing.
Luhmann uses a wonderfully visceral anatomical example for this. If you have a severe stomach ache, your foot doesn't hurt.
Yes.
The biological system localizes the pain. It doesn't radiate the disturbance everywhere because if every cell panicked when the stomach hurt, the organism would just die from shock. We can apply this to society. Let's create a case study to track through Luhmann's theory today.
Okay, I like that.
Imagine the sudden deployment of a controversial geoengineering technology, like stratospheric aerosol injection, to cool the planet. This is massive environmental disturbance. But society doesn't process it all at once. If this technology causes a massive shock to the economic markets, scientists don't suddenly have to change the laws of physics.
Right.
The scientific system observes the economic panic, but it isn't destroyed by it. It localizes the disturbance.
The system isolates the shock. It filters the noise. But if a system is fundamentally a mechanism that selects what to process and what to ignore, a really profound theoretical problem emerges. How does the system actually draw the line between what is quote-unquote inside its processing center and what is outside in the environment?
Right. If there is no physical wall, if society isn't a literal container, how does a social system know where it ends and the environment begins?
To solve this, Luhmann makes a radical, highly abstract mathematical leap. He turns to the British mathematician George Spencer Brown. Spencer Brown published a dense, brilliant book called Laws of Form. He created a calculus of distinctions. He argued that the foundational, primordial act of any cognition, any system, is the command to draw a distinction.
Draw a distinction. Okay, let's visualize this. Imagine I am standing in front of a giant, empty whiteboard. Before my marker touches the board, it is just a blank space, a void. There is no form. But the very millisecond I draw a circle on that board, I instantly create two things that did not exist a moment before. An inside and an outside.
Exactly.
And neither can exist without the other. The line itself creates the reality of both spaces.
That is the exact mechanism Luhmann ports over to sociology. For Luhmann, drawing that circle is the foundational act of a system. A system is no longer defined by an essence or a list of physical parts or a geographic boundary. A system is defined mathematically and logically as a two-sided form, the distinction between system and environment. Reality, for Luhmann, isn't made of solid objects, it is made of differences.
The ontological implications of that are staggering. It challenges the entire history of Western philosophy.
It really does.
Because traditional ontology is obsessed with being what things inherently are. Luhmann is arguing that we can never access what things are directly in a vacuum. We only access the world through the differences we draw. Difference, not being, is the center of reality.
It is a radically constructivist view. Every time a system operates, it uses that primary distinction. It looks at the world and categorizes it. Is this me or is this the environment? But Spencer Brown adds another layer to his calculus, a concept called re-entry.
Re-entry, yeah.
Re-entry occurs when a system takes the distinction between itself and its environment and reintroduces it back into the system.
Okay, let's apply that to our geoengineering case study. The economic system draws a boundary. It says, I am the market, so I'm the inside, and the physical atmosphere is the environment, the outside. But suddenly, this new stratospheric aerosol injection technology starts altering weather patterns, which destroys crop yields, which bankrupts agricultural supply chains. The environment is aggressively irritating the economy. So the economy has to take the concept of the physical environment and copy it back inside the economic system. It creates carbon pricing, weather derivatives, or climate risk insurance. It begins processing the outside world using its own internal financial codes. The distinction re-enters the system.
That is a perfect illustration of re-entry. The system creates an internal simulation of the external world, but it can only build that simulation using its own proprietary materials, in this case, money and prices. And this leads to Luhmann's massive epistemological consequence: the asymmetry of observation.
The asymmetry of observation, meaning what?
When you draw a distinction, you have to stand on one side of it to indicate the other. When you drew that circle on the whiteboard, your attention was either focused on the inside of the circle or the outside space. You cannot indicate both simultaneously. Therefore, every single observation contains a fundamental blind spot.
Meaning the system is blind to its own tools while it is using them. If I am looking through a telescope at a distant galaxy, I can see the stars, but I cannot see the lenses of the telescope itself in the exact moment I am looking through them. The tool of observation is invisible to the observer during the act of observation.
Exactly. The system cannot observe the distinction it is currently using to observe. It is a logical impossibility.
So if the system is completely blind to its own foundational boundaries while it operates, how on earth does it avoid collapsing into total chaos the second it encounters a new problem? That line drawn on the whiteboard is incredibly fragile. The chaotic environment wants to erase it. The system has to actively redraw its own boundary every single millisecond. It needs an engine.
And Luhmann finds that engine in the biological sciences. He borrows a concept that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction novel.
I know this one. Autopoiesis.
Autopoiesis.
Breaking down the Greek roots, auto meaning self, and poiesis meaning creation or production. The term was coined by two Chilean biologists, Humberto Maturana and Francisco Varela. They were trying to solve a very specific problem. defining what makes something biologically alive.
And they concluded that a living system is an autopoietic machine. Take a single biological cell. It is a network of chemical processes. But what does it produce? It produces the very molecules that make up its own cellular membrane and the internal chemical network itself. It constantly creates and recreates its own parts.
It is a machine that builds itself while it is running.
Exactly. If it stops producing its own elements, the boundary dissolves into the environment and the cell dies.
Now, Maturana and Varela were very strict about this concept. They insisted autopoiesis is strictly a biological phenomenon occurring in physical space. But Luhmann reads their work and commits what many considered absolute intellectual heresy.
So they were not happy with him.
He strips autopoiesis of its biological constraints and applies it to non-physical immaterial systems.
He scales it up. Luhmann argues there are three distinct types of autopoietic systems. Biological systems, like cells and bodies, which reproduce life. Psychic systems, which we can call human consciousness, which reproduce thoughts. And social systems, which reproduce communication.
Which brings us to the most scandalous reputation of his entire theory. If society is an autopoietic system and its fundamental elements are communications, then society is nothing but a self-reproducing network of communications generating more communications.
Yes.
Which leads to the inevitable jarring conclusion we teased at the beginning of the deep dive. Human individuals, our physical bodies, our pumping hearts, our private conscious thoughts are not part of social systems. We are relegated to the environment.
This is where readers of Luhmann often throw the book across the room.
I almost did.
It feels deeply alienating. It seems to evacuate human agency entirely. We are so used to theories that place the human subject at the absolute center of the universe.
It forces a severe pushback. Like, if I am not in society, where am I? How can society exist without human beings acting as the senders and receivers of information? Are we just batteries powering a matrix of language?
Well, Luhmann is not suggesting society can exist without humans. Humans are a necessary condition for society, just as oxygen is a necessary condition for biological human life. But you would never say that oxygen is part of a human thought.
Right.
You and I, our minds are operationally closed systems. I cannot literally rip a thought out of my neurological network and place it into yours. Our brains are impenetrable black boxes to one another.
That is undeniably true. I can only assume what you were thinking based on the sounds coming out of your mouth, but your actual consciousness is sealed off from me.
Because consciousness cannot communicate. Only communication communicates.
Wait, say that again? Only communication communicates.
Yes. When your psychic system generates a thought, it belongs to you. But the millisecond you translate that thought into words and speak them aloud, those words no longer belong to your mind. They belong to the social system.
Oh.
The social system takes those words, detaches them from your internal psychological state, and links them to other communications. Think of a viral internet meme. Millions of human minds interact with it, but the meme evolves and travels through the network with a life entirely independent of any single person's brain. The network of communication is self-reproducing.
But if my mind and society are totally separate, operationally closed systems, they clearly still interact. I mean, I watch the news, I get angry, I yell at my television. How does that exchange happen without the systems merging?
They interact through a mechanism Luhmann calls structural coupling.
Structural coupling?
Right. Psychic systems and social systems co-evolve. They exist in the same environment, and they constantly irritate or perturb each other. But they never overlap. They convert the noise of the other into meaningful information using only their own internal structures.
Okay, let's run our geoengineering case study through this mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
The stratospheric aerosol injection technology goes online. Sulfur is pumped into the atmosphere. The physical environment itself doesn't contain information or panic. It just contains airborne sulfur particles.
Exactly.
My biological respiratory system breathes it in. My nose detects the chemical change. But it is my psychic system that gets irritated and uses its internal memories to interpret this. My mind thinks, the sky looks weird, my throat burns, this geoengineering experiment is dangerous.
Yes.
My psychic system turns environmental chemical noise into conscious information. Then I log on to social media and write a furious post. They are poisoning the sky. At that moment, I have irritated the social system, which takes my text and begins processing it as political or scientific communication.
That is structural coupling flawlessly applied. The physical environment irritates the biological system, which irritates the psychic system, which irritates the social system, but none of the systems ever swap actual elements. And this is where Luhmann defends his theory against the charge of being anti-human. He argued that placing humans in the environment is actually the ultimate theoretical protection of human freedom.
I can actually see the architecture of that defense. Because if society were literally made of humans, if our minds were actually gears inside the machine of society, then the system would have to perfectly control our thoughts and bodies to maintain its operations. Totalitarianism is essentially the political attempt to pull the human fully inside the system, to make the state and the mind identical.
Exactly. By placing the individual firmly in the environment, Luhmann creates a post-humanist theory that guarantees your psychological autonomy. Society can bombard you with propaganda, it can irritate you with laws, it can constrain your physical movements, but it can never structurally force your operationally closed psychic system to think a certain way.
You are fundamentally radically free.
Radically free, albeit theoretically homeless, exiled to the environment.
It's a chilling but liberating perspective.
Yeah.
But it requires us to completely dismantle and rebuild our understanding of communication. If humans aren't the building blocks of society and communication is the autopoietic engine, what actually is communication for Luhmann? And what is the medium it operates within?
The medium for both psychic and social systems is meaning. But we have to be careful here. Luhmann doesn't use meaning in a spiritual, theological, or poetic sense. He defines it phenomenologically, drawing heavily on the philosopher Edmund Husserl. Meaning is defined as the continuous difference between actuality and potentiality.
Actuality and potentiality, meaning what is currently happening versus the horizon of what could happen instead.
Precisely. Meaning is the constant, unavoidable awareness that whatever is currently the focus of the system is just one selection out of an infinite horizon of other possibilities. When you are reading a book, that action is the actuality. But the potentiality is buzzing around the edges of your awareness. You could be watching television, you could be sleeping, you could be arguing with a neighbor.
Right.
Meaning is the mechanism that forces a system to constantly make selections to navigate complexity. And Luhmann categorizes this meaning into three specific dimensions: objective, temporal, and social.
Let's map those dimensions.
Yeah.
The objective dimension is about this versus that, inside versus outside. The temporal dimension is the distinction between past and future. And the social dimension navigates ego versus alter my perspective versus your perspective.
Right.
Every piece of communication navigates these three dimensions simultaneously. Which leads to how Luhmann completely rejects the classic model of communication we all learned in school, the Shannon-Weaver transmission model.
Yeah. Oh, he completely throws it out. The old engineering model is intuitive, but flawed for sociology. A sender encodes a message, transmits it through a channel, and a receiver decodes it. It treats communication like mailing a package.
Right.
Luhmann argues you aren't transmitting anything physical. You don't lose a piece of information from your brain when you share it with someone else. Instead, Luhmann defines communication as a triadic unity, a three-part synthesis of information, utterance, and understanding.
Information, utterance, and understanding. Let's ground this. Information is the pure content of the message. Utterance is how the physical act of saying it, writing it, or gesturing, but understanding is where Luhmann pulls off a magic trick. What is understanding in this triad?
Understanding is the receiver's ability to draw a distinction between the information and the utterance. It is the receiver realizing, this person is purposefully trying to tell me something rather than just making a random noise. But here's the radical twist: communication does not actually happen until the understanding occurs.
Wait, I need to synthesize that. How can the receiver's understanding retroactively create the communication? If I shout into a canyon and no one hears it, did I not communicate?
According to Luhmann, no.
No.
If you shout into a canyon, that is merely a psychic event and a biological utterance. It only becomes a social communication when another system processes it, understands it as an intentional utterance, and connects it to a subsequent communication. Therefore, the receiver essentially determines what the communication was.
That is wild.
The receiver's reaction is what crystallizes the previous event into the social system.
Well, that explains why misunderstanding is the default state of humanity. If we are closed off psychic black boxes and the receiver is the one retroactively defining what the communication was, it is a miracle we ever managed to coordinate anything.
Luhmann insists that misunderstanding in communication is the norm, not the exception. The fact that social order exists at all is mathematically highly improbable. And this leads to what Parsons originally identified and Luhmann refined as the fundamental problem of social order: double contingency.
Double contingency. It sounds like a tense geopolitical thriller. What is the actual mechanic here?
It is the problem of how two opaque black boxes manage to coordinate when both are waiting for the other to make the first move. Ego wants to act depending on what alter does, but alter wants to act depending on what ego does. It is a paralyzing standoff of mutual observation.
Let me build a scenario for this. Imagine two strangers walking toward each other on a narrow sidewalk. They lock eyes. They both realize they are on a collision course. My psychic system thinks, I'll step to the right if you step to your right. But your psychic system is processing the exact same contingency. We enter that awkward shuffling dance where we mirror each other side to side.
Oh, we've all been there.
Yeah, that is double contingency. My action is contingent on yours and yours is contingent on mine. Complete systemic paralysis.
That is a flawless illustration. So how is that paralysis ever resolved so that society can continue functioning?
Usually the tension breaks when one person finally just jerks to the left, forcing the other person to react.
And what you just described is Luhmann's solution to double contingency. It is a temporal solution. Time forces a sequence. Action breaks the paralyzing symmetry by setting an agenda. Once the first person acts, once they step to the left, it creates an asymmetry in time. The other person must now respond to that newly established reality. This temporal sequence, this chain of reactions, is the birth of social structure.
So social order literally emerges out of time.
Yes. Systems are composed of fleeting events that constantly disappear. Communications are like the ticking of a clock. The moment a word is spoken, it vanishes into the acoustic ether. The moment an action happens, it slips irreversibly into the past. Because social systems are built entirely out of these vanishing events, they are inherently unstable. They are constantly dissolving.
So how do they maintain their architecture?
They use structures. Structures absorb time by creating repeatable expectations out of these vanishing events.
It's like the system is desperately laying down train tracks just inches in front of a speeding locomotive to keep it from derailing. Society is an infinite autopoietic network of these vanishing communications, constantly dying and being replaced.
But as society evolves, moving from small, tribal, face-to-face interactions to massive, globalized, technologically mediated networks, the complexity explodes. The system has to figure out how to observe itself amidst all this vanishing noise. And this brings us to Luhmann's concept of second-order observation.
Which loops us all the way back to the blind spot of the Spencer-Brown distinction. If every observation contains a blind spot, if a system cannot see the distinction it is currently using, how does a highly complex society manage to see anything clearly?
A system cannot see what it cannot see. That is a hard limit. But it can observe how another system is observing. This is second-order observation.
Sociologists, for Luhmann, do not simply look at the world and declare what is objectively true. They act as second-order observers.
Okay, what does that mean in practice? They look at the distinctions other systems use to view the world, and they map the blind spots created by those distinctions.
So instead of a sociologist asking, is this geoengineering technology objectively safe? The sociologist asks, why is the scientific system using the true-false distinction to observe this technology, and what does that force them to ignore?
Precisely, and this analytical tool is essential because of how modern society is fundamentally structured. Pre-modern societies were stratified. They divided themselves by classes, hierarchies, or groups of whole persons like nobility at the top and peasantry at the bottom. But modern society, Luhmann argues, has evolved into functional differentiation.
Functional differentiation. This connects back to the ghost of Parsons and the AGIL schema, breaking society into specific functions. But Luhmann makes it entirely about autopoietic communication networks, right?
He does. Society no longer divides by classes of people. It divides by communication types, which we call functional subsystems. Each subsystem is operationally closed and operates using a highly specific, mutually exclusive binary code. The science system observes the entire world using only the code true-false. The legal system uses legal-illegal. The economy uses profit loss. Politics uses power opposition.
Let's run our geoengineering technology through this differentiated society.
Okay.
The stratospheric aerosols are deployed. The science system looks at the sky and asks, is it true or false that this chemical lowers global temperatures? The legal system looks at the exact same sky and asks, was deploying this chemical legal or illegal under international treaties? The economy looks at the sky and asks, will this weather disruption cause a profit or a loss for agricultural futures? They are all looking at the exact same event in their shared environment, but they are processing it through totally alien, mutually exclusive codes.
And they cannot translate their codes into one another. You cannot theoretically buy a scientific truth with money, and you cannot prove a mathematical theorem using legal statutes. This functional differentiation is the brilliant evolutionary mechanism that allows modern society to handle massive complexity. By dividing the labor of observation, society can process infinitely more information, but it also creates massive, terrifying blind spots.
Because the economy cannot solve ecological problems on its own. Its code is profit loss, not healthy sick. If destroying the ozone layer is highly profitable, the economic system will continue doing it until the physical environment collapses and forces a re-entry through raw scarcity. This constructivist epistemology, the idea that knowledge doesn't map reality perfectly but is an internal construction, often draws comparisons to post-structuralist philosophy, doesn't it?
It does.
The sources explicitly contrast Luhmann's systems theory with Jacques Derrida and the mechanics of deconstruction. Both deal heavily with texts, communication, disorder, and paradoxes. But they approach the machine from opposite ends.
It is a fascinating intellectual collision. Derrida looks at the paradoxes of language and text and sees what he considers illegitimate asymmetry. He sees domination. Derrida believes the Western metaphysical tradition has artificially imposed violent hierarchies on language, privileging speech over writing, presence over absence, man over woman.
Right.
His philosophical project is to deconstruct those binaries, to reveal the underlying disorder and expose the power structures. Luhmann, however, believes the paradox of self-reference and asymmetry comes first.
Meaning the system has to draw an asymmetrical distinction just to exist in the first place, just to avoid collapsing into the void of the whiteboard.
Yes. For Luhmann, asymmetry isn't inherently evil, dominant, or illegitimate. It is a functional mathematical necessity for life and meaning to persist. A system must privilege the inside over the outside simply to operate. Deconstruction wants to dismantle the machine to free the components. Luhmann wants to map the machine to understand how it delays its own death.
This philosophical friction brings up the most famous confrontation of Luhmann's career, the 1971 debate with the German critical theorist Jürgen Habermas.
Oh, the Habermas debate.
Yes, Habermas was a heavyweight of the Frankfurt School, deeply invested in human emancipation, rationality, and moral critique. He developed the theory of communicative action, which argued that the goal of communication is to reach a rational consensus. He looks at Luhmann's autopoietic, functionally differentiated theory and is just appalled.
Appalled is a good word for it.
He essentially calls Luhmann a neoconservative technocrat. He says, your theory has no moral dimension. It has no utopian vision for a better society. It just describes a cold running machine.
And Luhmann's response was characteristically detached, which infuriated his critics even more. He dismissed traditional moral critique as an outdated, old European relic. Luhmann argued that morality is not some transcendent truth. It is just another functionally differentiated form of communication, coded as good-bad or esteem-esteem. And in fact, he viewed morality as a highly volatile, highly dangerous form of communication.
Dangerous. Why would a sociologist view morality as a threat to the system?
Because when you moralize an issue, you corner people. You strip away complexity and force them into a binary of being a good person or a bad person. It severely restricts the horizon of potentiality. Luhmann observed that modern functional systems, like the economy or science, actually operate much more efficiently without morality. A scientific truth isn't morally good, it's just true.
Right.
A market transaction isn't moral, it's just profitable. By trying to inject normative morality into every functional system, Habermas, in Luhmann's view, was trying to force a hyper-complex modern society backwards into a pre-modern tribal state of integration.
The critical essays in our sources refer to Luhmann as the Lucifer of sociology.
The Lucifer of sociology, yeah.
The cold, detached, almost alien observer of humanity. And I have to bring the listener's resistance into the room here because this is where the theory hurts. Does Luhmann's theory entirely evacuate human agency and political critique? If everything is just an operationally closed, autopoietic system blindly reproducing its own code, are we humans just hopelessly trapped in the environment watching a giant machine run itself off a cliff? Is there no room to say, the deployment of this geoengineering technology is unjust and we must stop it?
It is the most urgent critique leveled at systems theory. It is incredibly abstract and intentionally lacks a normative anchor. It will not tell you what is right or what you should do. But Luhmann would counter that his theory is the ultimate tool for practical enlightenment, precisely because it prevents you from being politically naive.
How so?
If you want to stop the economic system from deploying that geoengineering technology, standing outside Wall Street and yelling moral arguments about justice will fail because the economic system is deaf to the good-bad code. It only processes profit loss.
So if you want to change the machine, you have to translate your irritation into a code the machine can actually read. You have to make the geoengineering financially unprofitable. You have to introduce legal liability so the legal system flags it as illegal.
Exactly. Luhmann isn't saying you cannot change society. He is providing you with the actual unsentimental schematics of the machine so you know which levers actually connect to the engine. Moral outrage might soothe your psychic system, but it bounces off the operational closure of the social system.
So what does this all mean for us? We have traversed an incredible intellectual landscape today. We started with Parsons' massive static filing cabinet of structural functionalism. We watched systems theory evolve through thermodynamics and cybernetics, realizing that systems must ride the wave of imbalance and openness to survive entropy. We stood at the whiteboard with Spencer Brown, learning that reality is constructed by drawing asymmetrical distinctions against a chaotic void.
We evicted the human being from the center of society, realizing that we exist in the environment structurally coupled to but separate from a self-reproducing, autopoietic network of vanishing communications. We learn that meaning is the constant navigation between actuality and potentiality.
And we discovered that this hyper-complex society observes itself through functionally differentiated systems, science, law, economy, politics, each operating with its own binary code, and each suffering from its own massive, inescapable blind spot.
The practical power of adopting this systems theoretical mindset is immense. By accepting that you are not inside the social system, you are freed from the exhausting expectation that society's rationality must match your personal psychological rationality.
Yeah.
It allows you to observe institutions, your workplace, the media, the government, as closed systems executing specific codes. When a corporation does something that seems morally absurd, you don't have to view it solely as a moral failing of the individuals inside. You can view it as an autopoietic system blindly executing its profit loss code to delay its own entropy. It provides a radical, detached clarity.
It gives you a kind of analytical armor against the chaos of the modern world. Which brings me back to the provocation we started with. You are not in society. You are in its environment. And if every single observation contains a blind spot, well, if you can only see the world through the distinctions you draw to separate yourself from the infinite noise, what is the foundational distinction you use to navigate your own life? And more importantly, what is the massive, invisible blind spot that distinction forces you to ignore every single day? Something to mull over. Until next time, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.